Dear learners, good afternoon. As you all know, we are dealing with MGPE-13, and today we will be dealing with the civil society and the state, civil society in globalized market, civil society in political regimes, civil society resistance and protest. Dear learners, here, dear learners, here we will be focusing on the state and the civil society. The very concept of the state, there is no unanimity about its meaning because such contesting notions about the state is nomenclated by different persons and from if you focus some of the key concepts that we can say from the Latin word uh, which means a situation or the state and the first to use the term was the great exponent Machiavelli and to him the state is used to convey a historical or a philosophical idea in the eternal form of political to the political community, which is specifically a modern phenomenon. Every day we come across the word state, and when you go through the newspapers, the different media, that we get to know about the state. That means it is an integral part of the human beings. It is a political entity that possesses people, territory, a government, and a sovereignty. And the government goes with different policies, the decides different policies that makes and declares and enforces law. We know that the state is doing some work, and as a part of the entity, we say they are doing good or bad work. Even we give our suggestion uh, to the state, and sometimes, as you know, that when the government enunciates any new policy, they also invite some suggestions. And as an integral part, because we are a part of the state, we give our suggestions. And when that is implemented, uh, we can say it is it is of benefit for the people. The government thus is a policy deciding body that makes, declares, and enforces a law. It can exist and does exist without a state as history, and administration is a set of persons and bodies that work under the directions of the government and discharge their duties. And we have a right, and as worthy citizens, we also give our suggestions, and they also uh, take it uh, in the right spirit. Thus, a government is the political executive, while administration is the permanent executive. Here I may say that the government, it comes for say 5 years, but here, dear learners, I want to emphasize that the administrative part, for example, now we have the civil services, civil servants, the there is a chief secretary, the chief minister. The chief minister is the leader of the majority of the political party, and the bureaucrats, they are permanent in nature. And thus, we can say a government is the political executive, or the administration is the permanent executive. The state is highly differentiated, specialized, and complex, upholding the difference between the private and the public space. And we may say that sometimes a distinction is made between the state and some interrelated terms like society, community, association, and nations. There are varieties. There is, say, for example, there is a teachers association. There are trade unions. They have their own associations, and say the senior citizens. They have their own association, and that is the association. A society like the state consists of the people within a given territory engaged in the activities, but a society concerns itself with the social order while the state with the legal order. The persons in the society, but natural, they will have the different social issues, and whereas the government part, they have the administration with them, and when they make any law, that is the legal aspects. Thus, society is a whole made up of many voluntary associations, each with specific tasks and purposes, and includes the family right up to, to the societal level. Like the society, the idea of a community stands for fellowships, personal intimacy, and wholeness, and is characterized by a common end of good. The state is bureaucratic and a government body of institutions and officials with a special purpose of maintaining a, the schemes of legal actions and acting through laws enforced by direct and the positive sanctions. Some at times some pertinent questions are raised, and a modern thinker, Daniel Bell, he raised a vital questions with regard to the modern state, and he observed that the modern state is too big for small problems and too small for the big problems, indicating to the fragmentation of politics both within and outside the state. So, dear learners, not only this led to a situation of more federalizing tendencies within the state, but also the challenges posed by the global civil society. Because the human beings, they have their own ethos, and as entity, they have their own problem, And now, as I said, local, then the state, national level, and the global level. And we have to cater to the different, because we are not now living in an isolated world. The world is a various mass media. We get to know what is happening in different parts of the world. So it is a global also. The state as an all-powerful is a thing of the past, as it has to contain with plurality of associations within the civil society. Such associations may not always be critical of the state, but instead represents the manifold and diverse individual interests. Thus, the concept of the state lies at the center of any meaningful political theorizing, but there is no unanimity about its meaning, content, and definition. It is because of such contesting notions about the state that there was the behavioral revolution, and one noted thinker, David Easton, substituted the word system for the state. State. Most often, the state is understood by the person as they perceive it. The state is not the government, as governments change periodically. As I said, in 5 years, we have our uh, general election, and also we have the parliamentary elections. And to give an example, that now it is 2025. In 2024, in Odisha, we had the simultaneous election for the state assembly as well as for the parliament. And the electorate, they elected the government. And for example, as you all know, as you all are aware, that the earlier in our state, the earlier government of Sri Naveen Patnaik was the chief minister for 24 years. He was changed, and the new BJP government was formed, uh, and Sri Mohanlal Maji became the chief minister and his council of ministers. And we also elected for the Parliament of India 21 Lok Sabha members, and they were elected, and they are advocating the our. So this is how the things are materialized, and I must emphasize that there is periodic change after every 5 years, but there are also situations where if some members uh, owing to their death, and there is a by-election. State is distinguished by political theories from the civil society, which refers to the whole gamut of organized and permanent institutions and the behavioral practices like the economy, religious institutions, schools, and centers of higher learning and cultural centers, places of ordinary day-to-day activity of the average citizens. A state refers to a fixed political system. A state, dear learners, a state refers to a fixed political system and an organized community that exercises authority legitimately and authoritatively. The state, as an all powerful entity, is a thing of the past as it has to contain the plurality of associations within the civil society. Such associations may always be critical of the state, but instead represent manifold and diverse individual interests. Here, what I want to say and emphasize is that all the different associations, it may be a teachers association or a trade union association or a senior citizens association, they cater to their own need because they form an association and they are representing the diverse individual interest. For example, if you get a short question that what is an individual interest in the state and what is the group interest, so we can easily say when it pertains to a certain individuals, it is individual interest, and when it is group, for example, say the teachers, they want their uh, pay parity or they want some facilities from the government, they represent their own interest. The senior citizens, they want some facilities for their for health care. So that is their diverse interests. And such things are very pertinent in the civil society and they are needed for the well-being of the state and the society. Now, if you go for the civil society in the globalized market, the civil society is one of the most complicated concept in the history of social and political thought. Scholars such as Locke and Montesquieu, representing two different traditions, have to say about civil society needs to be given primary consideration when studying different issues. The thinkers have shown due diligence not to overlook the concept of the state when defining the civil society. In this context, the cooperation existence in the society started to be defined by the public opinion as the presence of continuous and deep running cultural codes and different organizations. The civil society is also, according to some thinkers, there are social interactions between the economy and the state, its own constitutions and novel forms created modern civil society. As this subjective rights institutionalized and generalized by the law trigger social differentiation theories of civil society started defined by the state society dichotomy to make their many variations visible. The globalized market. The globalization is not an entirely new concept. Indeed, it states back centuries if we recall the vast trading empires built around the world. But present day globalization is distinct, aided by new markets, new tools, new actors, new rules, sinking space, sinking time, and disappearing borders. The process of integrating at an accelerated pace markets and economies worldwide. Today's globalization, driven by market expansion, is outpacing governance of these markets and their repercussions on people. While globalization has several positive, innovative, dynamic aspects, the overall achievement remains the expectations and promises of globalization. It has proceeded with extremely uneven distributions of benefits and costs across nations, resulting in marginalization in some cases. The globalization has intensified with changes in the international political system, in the international market economy, and in transportation and information technology. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War has spawned an international movement towards democracy. Formerly totalitarian regimes that had sustained themselves, at least in part of by acting as allies to either the United States or the Soviet bloc, were suddenly exposed by the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. They were suddenly vulnerable to their own citizens and their long suppressed demands for democratic regimes and could find no help from the powers that had once competed competed for their favor to secure the advantages. New liberal government policies created in the mid 1980s reduced barriers to the international flow of capital, goods, and services worldwide. Value chain coordinations and integration increased. Distributions gained importance over production in the process of accumulation and increasingly controlled the food value. In order to increase capital accumulation, firm negotiated, tested, renegotiated, and implemented different mechanisms for control of the value chains. The new pattern of accumulation disadvantaged producers of raw commodities, particularly in the food-based value chain. In the process, becoming more demand-oriented, the conventions around certain commodities changed from market convention to the industrial convention. The convention theory was developed by the French economists in order to better understand coordination in economic, political, and social life through chains and networks. Here, learners, sometimes they may ask you a short questions. How the some of the, for example, the convention theory was developed by from which part of the world? You can easily say that the convention theory was developed by the French economists in order to better understand coordinations in economic, political, and social life through chains and networks. Conventions are shared norms and values, standards of uniformity and the rules and institutions to apply and enforce those standards. Most of these modern researches around the conventions theory in agriculture has been around the formation of alternative value chains built on either civic conventions, particularly looking at organic agriculture and fair trade, and the domestic conventions or, or the regard convention. For much agriculture, the shift from the market convention where the value, the lowest price per unit, and producers were rewarded for volume with minimum quality standards to industrial conventions. It was in this context that pent-up demands for consumer and capital goods followed, led to investment in the industry. The development resulted in golden age of capitalism though through the 1950s and 1960s, where low unemployment and rising income created the increased demand that fueled production. The end of the Cold War left the US as the sole superpower. This meant that much of the foreign policy security preoccupations gave way to a more aggressive and focused expansion of international capitalism that was less tolerant of obstacles to capital mobility. The Cold War period and beyond that developed a coherent alternative economic model that challenged the logic of neoliberalism. This is this was so-called the Asian capitalism characterized by a high degree of state initiatives to save the cost of the different factors of production because the land, the labor, the capital involved to try and favor particular economic, especially industry outcomes rather than leave this to the mercy of the market. The Asian model was possible through trade access, aid, or investment from the West during the Cold War period. This support was tied neither to a preferred economic nor political regime. Thus, dear learners, while Japan was a democracy, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan were firmly authoritarian. So successful was this economic model that it not only generated a rapid industrialization, but also by the 1980s, it had created powerful conglomerates capable of competing with those of the West and generated strong outward flows of Asian investment. However, the brief economic in the early 1980s presented an opportunity for international financial institutions to promote enhanced economic liberalization reforms in Asia. Recovery was swift but persistent. Efforts were made by various interests attached to consolidate and extend on such reforms. Following the end of the Cold War, the lack of an obvious security imperative had directed US foreign policy in ways that had emphasized economic policy and placed a limited but important emphasis on liberal political values. This was especially evident during the presidency of Clinton at USA after the September 11. However, the war on terrorism raised questions, severe political questions about the continued prospects for the development of economic and political liberalism in Asia and the context within which the respective struggles to advance them across the region are likely to take place. The elevation of security concerns within the US foreign policy in the war on terror heralds new challenges of development of new liberal globalization, which may be political concerns, whereas the post-Cold War period witnessed an unprecedented privileging of the newer liberal economic reforms agenda, which has to be balanced by the considerations of how to contain the terrorism. In the Asian region, an excellent example of the perspectives are recent moves towards bilateral free trade agreements, some of which are the need of the hour and very pertinent. Dear learners, the policymakers who are serious about maximizing the opportunities towards a new culture of democratic legitimacy in global decisions making process should be aware of their responsibilities. Sometimes we hear about the digital divide to digital opportunity. So far, some people say that the digital inequities, as referred to by the concept of the digital divide, do not in themselves significantly alter the existing patterns of representation in global governance process, and that it is the domestic conditions for civil society activity that are important in that place. Domestic ones in order to enable a thriving civil society, the international ones in order to increase the plurality and visibility in the global information space, and the global regime once for the case of global governance reform towards greater public deliberations, transparency, and accountability. If you consider together, this is the critical political dimensions of the digital divide when it comes to delivering on the democratic promises in the global governance regime. The emergence of the global civil society as an ideal has also meant emergence of an accompanying empirical reality. As a result, the transnational nature of the meaning of technological changes, social developments, communication, interaction, and institutional ties started to publicize global civil society. The global civil society, dear learners, can be said to have emerged between international civil society organizations and the state with the use of the international or global power as a collective entity. The global civil society manifests itself through global society and international civil society organizations. The most important manifestation of this is the important role played by an international civil society organization in the making of the global policies. Now, dear learners, that the statesmen in the Western countries, US, they are also thinking hard, trying hard, and raising a war on terrorism because the terrorism is disturbing the whole economic market. And even our worthy Prime Minister also, wherever he is visiting in the different foreign assignments, also giving importance for this, uh, the improving ties among the countries, ties among the political regimes, and the economy. Now, civil society and the political regimes. This is very crucial because, dear learners, the political regimes are the democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, dictatorship, and the republic. The civil society is a popular, normatively concept that does not have a single meaning. The concept of civil society and its perception as a problem or solution to the ills of the society and state are varied with intellectual traditions and the prevailing socio-political economic conditions. The concept, dear learners, the civil society in the 18th and the 19th century, Europe emerged in the context of the development of the commercial sphere and the modern state. The relationship of civil society to the state is often depicted as confrontational. This may be the case of certain situations, but in most cases, the state and civil society are mutually dependent for the survival. Civil society requires governance to survive, and the government, at least democratic ones, draw their strength on the civil society. The relationship of civil society to the state can take many forms by the state, deep penetration and influence over the state by certain civil society actors, productive tensions between the two in a context of overall agreement on the political and the economic framework. Dear learners, as I said, the term regime is used widely but quite loosely in the political science. It is quite often applied to a particular type of government, as I said, democracy, aristocracy, autocracy, dictatorship, and so on. Dear learners, you may get a short question uh, say, of democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, dictatorship, republic. They may give uh, uh, two, say two or three, and you have to answer on them. Say for democracy, you may emphasize that is a legislative system in which all citizens exercise direct and equal participation in the development, proposals, and passage of legislation into law. Even though it is identified As government of the people, by the people, and for the people, there is no specific definition of democracy. If they ask you about your learners to briefly say of democracy, you can say, as I said, democracy is a form of government which is of the people, by the people, and for the people. Equality and freedom have been identified as important characteristics of democracy since ancient times. These principles are reflected in all citizens being equal before the law and having equal access to the legislative process. Here, I may tell you that today is 15th of April and 14th we had the birth anniversary of Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar ji, the maker of the constitution, and he was also the first law minister of India we have celebrated, and all the ethos of democratic values has to be cherished in state level functions. Even now they are thinking of to have a grand Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Bhavan in the state capital of Odisha with all library facilities where young people who want to know more about democracy, they can learn. Dear learners, now coming to the aristocracy. Aristocracy is a form of government in which a few of the most famous citizens they rule. It largely means rule of the best. The concept evolved in ancient Greece, whereby a council of famous citizens was commonly used and contrasted with direct monarchy in which an individual king held the power. In Rome, the republic consisted of an aristocracy as well as consuls, a senate, and a tribal assembly. The republic ended with the death of Julius Caesar. Later, the aristocracy primarily consisted of an elite aristocratic class privileged by birth and often by wealth. Since the French Revolution, aristocracy has generally been contrasted with democracy in which all citizens hold some form of political power. In Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes described an aristocracy as a commonwealth in which the representative of the people is an assembly by part. Simply put, a government in only a certain part of the general public and represent the public. Now, dear learners, very briefly, I'm telling you about the dictatorship. The dictatorship can be defined as a government controlled by one person or a small group of people. We can call them as a coterie consisting of a group. And they give their directions to the leader, and the dictators works on the advice of this small group. In this, the power rests entirely on the person or group of people and can be obtained by force or by inheritance. A dictator may also take away much of its people's freedom. During the dictatorship, There is no freedom. A form of government that has the power to govern without the consent of those being governed, while totalitarianism describes a state that regulates nearly every aspect of public and private behavior of the people. In other words, dictatorship concerns the source of the governing power and totalitarianism concerns the scope of the governing power. In the sense, dictatorship, a contrast to democracy and totalitarianism and oppose pluralism wherein the government allows multiple lifestyles and the opinions. Now, dear learners, coming to the monarchy. A monarchy is a form of government in which all the political power is passed down to one individual, usually hereditary, known as a monarch or a king or queen. As a political entity, the monarch is the head of the state generally until their death or abdication and is wholly set apart from all other members of the state. Historically, the notion of monarchy may emerge under different circumstances. It may grow out of tribal kingship and the office of monarch becoming typically hereditary, resulting in successive dynasties or houses, especially when the leader is wise and able enough to lead the tribals. A state of monarchy is said to result that reveals the relationship between resource, communities, monarch, and his office. Even the strict hereditary succession could be tempered by systems of elective monarchy, where an assembly elects a new monarch out of a pool of eligible candidates. The concept has also been modernized on constitutional monarchies, where the title of monarch remains mostly ceremonial without or with very limited political power. The Republic. A republic, dear learners, is a form of government in which the people or some significant portions of them retain supreme control over the government. They have their say over the government. The term is generally also understood to describe a government where most decisions are made with reference to established laws rather than the discretion of head of the state, and therefore monarchy is today generally considered to be incompatible with being a republic. One common modern definition of a republic is a government having a head of the state who is not a monarch. The word republic is derived from the Latin phrase res publica, which can be translated as a public affair, and often used to describe a state using this form of government. Now, dear learners, let me tell you something about the welfare state. A welfare state is a concept of government where the state plays the primary role in protection and promotion of economic and social well-being of its citizens. It is based on the principle of equality, opportunity, equitable distribution of wealth, and public responsibility for those unable to avail themselves of a minimal provision for a good life. The general term may cover a variety of forms of economic and social organization. Sometimes, dear learners, we hear about the Asian crisis and the regime convergence. Dear learners, the onset of the Asian economic crisis in 1997 had profound implications for ideas about alternatives to economic and political liberalism in the region. The crisis instantly generated confident attacks on Asian capitalism, the developmental state, and authoritarian regimes. Results came from both within and beyond the region and involved a conjuncture of forces for economic and political liberalism, sometimes interesting with each other's reform agenda, but not always. Dear learners, sometimes we hear the war on terrorism and political regimes, the elevation of security concerns within the US foreign policy, in the war on terror heralds new challenges for the development of neoliberal globalization, which may see political concerns return to the center stage. Whereas the post-Cold War period witnessed an unprecedented privileging of the new liberal economic reform agenda balanced by the considerations of how to contain the terrorism. The war on terrorism changes the context in which neoliberal globalization, because the interests of US capital in having markets open are moderated by security concerns. The change context has empowered neo-conservatives within the US administration whose perspectives about the market has long been tempered by more traditional foreign policy emphasis, or at least a different appreciation of the nexus between US economic and political power had been reflected by the different arrangements. One of the striking trends mapping the post-Cold War regime types is the steady decline in closed authoritarian regimes. The key initial driver for this trend, of course, was the end of the Cold War itself and the global spread of democratization. Part of this is due to the stabilization of war-affected countries, such as, for example, Rwanda, Congo, Uganda, Yemen, Sudan, etc. Rulers of these countries have sought to hold multi-candidate elections as a means to legitimate and consolidate their political control. These rulers, however, exploited the recent and ongoing instability to squash the opposition and ensure they prevailed overwhelmingly in the election. Consequently, many of these regimes became authoritarian regimes, contributing to the corresponding rise in this regime type. These regimes that explain why, or surprisingly, the African countries made up a plurality of hegemonic authoritarian regimes since the 1990s. Political regimes have evolved over a period of time, but it was not until the mid 19th century that political regimes were associated with states. After Aristotle, who talked of state and regime, perhaps the most profound analysis of political regimes was given by Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes. The political regimes have ranged from autocracy, monarchy, democracy, dictatorship, and so on. The evolution process has brought the democratic welfare system, state system, as the most stable and benevolent from the regime that encourages people's participation in administration, among other things. Dear learners, why I say the welfare state system? The welfare state system, they cater to the welfare of each individual in the society, and thus the evolution process has brought the welfare system as the most stable and benevolent form of regime that encourages people's participation in administration, among other things. About the various regimes and types I discussed, I told you about democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, dictatorship, republic, and welfare state. And in the past, we have seen that they give the club and formulate a question, and you have to answer them in when you write the exam paper that discuss about democracy and dictatorship. They club or discuss about monarchy and the republic, or they give a separate what in your mind is a welfare state and explain in your own words. You may not be bookish and you have to write the different things about the welfare state in your own words. Now, the civil society, the resistance, and the protest. The concept, dear learners, the civil society arose at the very dawn of the modern age as a theory of political economy and market capitalism in the writings of Rousseau, Smith, Hegel. Even after Marx, it under his analysis of bourgeois society, a linguistically identical term in German, the concept remains bound to its evil twin from them until the 1980s. Various scholars and exponents of political scientists, scholars revived and redefined drawing account of the public sphere and Tocqueville's analysis, the voluntary association. The theory of hegemony and Foucault's concept of discourse, both popular in the 1970s and the 1980s, had pointed a way out of Marxism by drawing attention from the economic to culture as the of central locus and the power in the civil society. Meanwhile, the rise of gender studies, perhaps the most consequential site of scholarly innovations, 1990s, offered a host of ways in the civil society's history, in private life, and public ideology. Today, interest in civil society forms a cornerstone of the new interdisciplinary arena, embracing historians, sociologists, and political science working on all regimes of the modern world. Today, today in this modern world, we come across the interdisciplinary approach. Dear learners, I must say this is very important approach, the interdisciplinary. Here, the discipline of history, sociology, political science, they come across and find a mutual. They are not watertight compartment. You segregate political science from history, history from economics. They are all social science subjects. And thus, interdisciplinary approach. Sometimes, dear learners, they may give a short questions, discuss about the interdisciplinary approach. Here, you can rightly say that there is no compartmentalize. They help each other. Every discipline is contributing substantially to the other discipline. We cannot differentiate in toto history from politics, from political science, from economics. They are all interdisciplinary. Even the central university like Jawaharlal Nehru University, Maharashtra University, even the social science faculty of Indira Gandhi National Open University, our university, is giving high priority on the interdisciplinary approach because all the exponents are working on different regions in the modern world and giving a lot to the present society. The relation of law and civil society begs an important question and what is its relationship with the resistance and the protest. Dear learners, there have emerged over the past 3 centuries a variety of responses. The Ford Foundation has pointed out at least three significant definitions that have taken a center stage. Civil society as part of society in the form of associations, groups of people operating within society at large. Secondly, civil society as a kind of society, value based, creating the good. Thirdly, the civil society as a public sphere, the arena for public debate and argument, a public space in which differences between community, cultural identity, and public policies are debated. As per the traditional definitions of civil society, it is composed of the totality of civic and social organizations and institutions that form the basic basis of a functioning society, as distinct from the force-backed structures of a state. From a historical perspective, the actual meaning of the concept of civil society has changed from its original classical form. The first change occurred after the French Revolution and the second during the fall of the communism in Europe. The concept of civil society in its pre-modern classical republican understanding is usually connected to the early modern thoughts of age of enlightenment in the 18th century. Generally, dear, dear learners, generally, the civil society has been referred to as a political association governing special conflict through the imposition of rules that restrain citizens from harming one another. A political scientist, W. F. Hegel, completely changed the meaning of civil society, giving rise to a modern liberal understanding of it as a form of market society, as opposed to institutions of modern national state. For Marx, civil society, dear learners, was the base where productive forces as social relations were taking place, whereas political society was the superstructure agreeing the link between capitalism and civil society. Later represents the interest of the bourgeoisie. Therefore, the state as superstructure also represents the interest of the dominant class. Under capitalism, it maintains the domination of the bourgeoisie. The postmodern way of understanding civil society was first developed by political opposition in the former Soviet bloc, East European countries in the 1980s. However, in the 1990s, with the emergence of the non-governmental organizations and the new social movements on a global scale, civil society as a third sector became a key terrain of strategic actions to construct an alternative social order, world order. By the end of the 1990s, civil society was seen less as a panacea amid the growth of the anti-globalization movement and the transition of many countries to democracy. Instead, civil society was increasingly called on to justify its legitimacy and democratic credentials. Postmodern civil society theory has not largely returned to a more neutral stance, but with the marked differences between and writing on the civil society in developing the states. Dear learners, I'm little bit highlighting on resistance and the protest. Sushil, are you listening? When Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the father of
Yes,
the
sir.
nation, was born in 1869, India was a colony of the British Empire. I had highlighted how Gandhiji was a down-to-earth person. After getting his law degree, he experimented and worked in South Africa by the call of Pandit Gokhale. He returned to India. He addressed the students of Banaras University in 1916, and Gandhi toured the whole of country and gave his own Gandhian principles. Yesterday, I had highlighted how the monumental work, My Experiments with Truth. My experiments with truth, I must say with emphasis, is an worth reading book, not only for our country people, but all over the world. And Gandhiji has done it, and hats up to him. And you must visit the Sabarmati Ashram and Wardha Ashram to know about his principles. The Gandhi family lived in a region of India that had not been greatly influenced by the Western culture. People of that region in Gujarat followed the same customs and traditions as their ancestors had for generations. The life of the young Mohandas centered on his mother, who taught him about the Hindu doctrine of ahimsa and refusal to do harm and the duty to do good. The mother is the real mentor for a person in the family, and they cater for truth, non-violence, that is Satya and Ahimsa. This belief was foundation for the bold and courageous acts that led to the Gandhi's fame as a proponent of non-violent resistance. Gandhiji called the non-violent resistance the Satyagraha, which means the force contained in truth and love. Non-violent resistance. The philosophy of Satyagraha required that a person who decided to break a law considered unjust must accept the consequences of that decision. The resistance functions to restructure the society. In that, new leadership emerges, traditional authority pattern are challenged, and anti-colonialism provides for integration and cohesion among diverse ethnic and religious groups. The protest, non-violent protest and persuasion is a class which includes large numbers of methods which are mainly symbolic acts of peaceful opposition or of attempt persuasion extending beyond verbal expression but stopping short of non-cooperation or non-violent intervention. Among these methods are picketing, posters, mourning, and protest meeting. Protest may be manifested as a complaint. Protest, dear learners, may be manifested as a complaint, objection, disapproval, or display of unwillingness to an idea, course of action, or social conditions. Protest, it may be argued, stems from an active desire for change, while the process of developmental change frequently originates from the impact of the protest. Protest and resistance may lead to crisis, an unstable state of affairs in which a decisive change may be impending. Crisis relates to physical and human problems. In one country, for instance, crisis may be the result of droughts or floods, may also be caused by structural changes in the regional economy or by successes and failure of attempts to find solutions to problems, to welfare policies, the migration of people from area to area, and so forth. The concept protest and resistance relates also to opposition and the conflicts. Opposition is a manifestation of protest or resistance against the control and use of power in society and occurs when those subjects with experience shared feelings of exploitation and oppression. Exploitation is dependent on social expectations, those of group or group subject to the power, which determines how they react to given demands for obedience. Dear learners, I emphasize here that the concept of non-violence is an attribute of protest and resistance. Very simple words. You may get a question in the your term exam. Elucidate non-violence as an attribute of protest and resistance. Non-violence means abstaining from the use of physical force. Don't use any force. If you use physical force or a police force, it's not non-violence. As an ethical philosophy, it upholds the views that moral behavior excludes the use of violence. As a political philosophy, it maintains that violence is self-perpetuating and can never provide a means to a securely peaceful end. As a principle, it supports the pacifist position that war and killings are never justifiable. You see, just one example you can give, and it will be a novelty. That you see, there are two world wars. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, and there was subsequently it came to an end with the Paris Peace Conference, and subsequently there was the League of Nations, but it could not control the war. There was the rise of Nazism and fascism, rise of Hitler, to power. And you see what happened Nazi Germany, Rome, Berlin, Tokyo axis, coming of the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, then the Cold War, then the establishment of the UNO peacekeeping body. I say this because there is violence. No non-violence means was adopted in the two wars. This you can give as an example. Non-violence means abstaining from the use of physical force to achieve an aim, whether it is World War or a between two nations war or a war in the society over any eh, over any issue. Eh, there is war, there is violence. As an ethical philosophy, it upholds the view that moral behavior excludes the use of violence. As a political philosophy, it maintains that violence is self-perpetuating and can never provide a means to a securely peaceful end. As a principle, it supports the pacifist position that war and killings are never justifiable. I just told you. Lot of devastation, men and materials, havocs of the two wars, gradual establishment of the eh, United Nations Organization, UNO, on 24th October 1945, for peacekeeping body. As a practice, it has been used by pacifists and non-pacifists alike to achieve social change and express resistance to oppression. Historically, non-violent practices have included civil disobedience, non-cooperation, passive resistance or non-resistance, and non-violent direct actions in the form of protest. The first situation, the practice civil disobedience when they refused to pay taxes, supporting the British war effort during the American War of Independence. During the Second World War, which I just cited you before you, 1939, 1945, Danish seabuilders practiced non-cooperation when they faced misunderstanding and worked so poorly that their ship could not be used in war. Passive resistance, turning the other cheek and refusing to hit back, has been practiced and promoted by followers of both Jesus and Buddha. Tolstoy preached non-resistance in its specific sense. Mahatma Gandhi used non-violence successfully in India. Mahatma Gandhi, dear learners, used non-violence to successfully free India from the British rule. He called his idea Satyagraha. And there is a song also. ना खड़ग बिना ढाल साबरमती की संत तूने कर दिया कमाल रघुपति घबरा ना खड़ग बिना ढाल साबरमती की संत तूने कर दिया कमाल रघुपति राजा राम. My hearts to towards the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, preaching non-violence, not before the Britishers in India, but before the whole world, and his principles of non-violence and truth is a milestone in both the history of India and the history of the world. He called Mahatma Gandhi, he called his ideas Satyagraha, meaning intensely active yet non-violent resistance. He believed that non-violent resistance focused on the power of the spirit, while violent resistance refused. Resistance focused on the power of the soul. From this belief and the belief that the spirit is stronger than the soul, Gandhi came to a conclusion. I believe that non-violence is infinitely superior to violence. Forgiveness is more manly than punishment. Why can't we forgive our enemies? Always we are tormenting in ourselves, having conflict. ऐसे कर दिया, वो कर दिया, उसको punishment दे दो. No forgiveness. Go to the principles of Mahatma Gandhi. I must quote that Mahatma Gandhi always said, "My critics are my best friends." I give salutation, Mahatma Gandhi said, to my critics. I don't condemn them. I never criticize them, but I salute them. They are my best friends. This is the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, to the critics. Martin Luther King Jr. used non-violent resistance to reconcile his religious belief with his passion for social justice. You see, social justice also is the need of the hour, and Martin Luther King did it. And this enabled him to make great advances with the United States towards racial equality. Over the lifetime, he had read books written by Karl Marx, Temple, and others. None could completely explain how Martin Luther King's religious and civic duties should coincide until he discovered the works of Gandhi. Subsequently, his writing, the intellectual and the moral satisfaction that I failed to gain from the utilitarianism of Mill, the revolutionary methods of Marx and Lenin, the social contract theory of Hobbes, the back to nature optimism of Rousseau, and the Superman philosophy of Nietzsche, I found in the non-violent resistance philosophy of Gandhi. In modern times, non-violence has, be- has become a powerful tool for social protest. And this social protest must continue with the non-violent method. There are several examples of its use in non-violent resistance and non-violent revolution, including Gandhi leading a decade-long non-violent struggle against British rule in India. Martin Luther King's adoption of Gandhi's non-violent methods in the struggle to win civil rights for African Americans, campaign of non-violence in the 1960s, the protest of treatment of farm workers in California, the 1989 revolution in the Czechoslovakia that saw the overthrow of the communist government is considered as one of the most important non-violent revolutions of 1989. Dear learners, non-violent is very prominent and acts of protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, non-violent intervention, non-violent resistance. Non-violent resistance is the practice of achieving socio-political goals through symbolic protest, civil disobedience, economic or political non-cooperation. Political non-cooperation and other methods without using violence. It is largely synonymous with both non-cooperation and non-violent intervention and blends the better of the two. Dear learners, some of the protest movements in the recent world were in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and the Gulf countries. In Egypt, there were protest activities from 1998 to 2004, 2005, 2006, 7, 2007. In Jordan, there was protest movement, widespread protest movement in 1989. In Morocco, there was widespread protest movement in 2007. And in the Gulf countries, the only two countries to have experienced numerous episodes are Kuwait and Bahrain. And in both the motives and demands were political. In Kuwait, episodes of protest centered on political and civil rights and were driven by middle and upper class professionals. The reduction in number of voting districts was considered by many in Kuwait as essential for curbing vote buying and the influence of tribal loyalties. Some early resistance movements and which are pertinent in the world context are in Albania, Denmark, France, Palestine. In Albania, faced with an illiterate, agrarian, and mostly Muslim society monitored by King George, security police, Albania, communist movement attracted few adherents in the interwar period. I talk to you, dear learners, about the Second World War. During the World War II, Denmark was invaded in 1940, and the Danes saw that military confrontation would change nothing except the number of Danes left to be occupied. The Danish government therefore adopted a policy of official cooperation they called negotiation under protest. Under protest. And it was during the Second World period in 1940. The Danish resistance against the Nazis proved highly effective. France. In 1971, the French government announced their intention to extend the military camp on the Large Plateau, an arid area in southern France, where they claimed that almost nobody lived. Local farmers strongly disagreed with this assessment and inspired by the example of Lanja Telvasto, a philosopher and follower of Mahatma Gandhi, who had gone on hunger strike for 2 weeks. In their support, they embarked on a campaign of non-violent resistance. Palestine, despite the common mischaracterization of Palestine resistance as wholly violent or radical, there is a long and rich history of non-violent actions and campaigns, as well as large number of contemporary ones. 1902, 1936, 1986, 87 to 1993. And dear learners, I must highlight what the famous, world-renowned Albert Einstein wrote: in our age of moral decay, Gandhi, M.K. Gandhi, is the only statesman who represented that higher conception of human relations. I repeat, higher conception of human relations in the political sphere, which we must aspire with our all powers. Martin Luther King words: I could never reach the standard of morality. I could never reach the standard of morality, simplicity, and love for the poor set by the Mahatma. Gandhi was a human without weakness, still resonate. Aung San Suu Kyi, winner of the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize 1991, for her non-violent resistance to government tyranny in Myanmar, acquired a lasting admiration for the principles of non-violence embodied in the life and philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. Dear learners, His Holiness is Dalai Lama. His Holiness is the Dalai Lama of Tibet. India regards highly to His Holiness Dalai Lama of Tibet and relates the inspiration of Gandhi. I had still, I had, I had and still have unshaken faith in the doctrine of non-violence which he preached and practiced. Now I made up my mind more firmly to follow his lead, whatever difficulties might confront me. Dear learners, you see the non-violence of M.K. Gandhi is really working wonders. Even today, I am quoting Rabindranath Tagore, who won Nobel Prize in Gitanjali, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high into that heaven of freedom. Oh, Father, let my country away. Dear learners, I am quoting this because Rabindranath Tagore had great respect for Mahatma Gandhi, and He wished that every Indian follow his doctrines, work in the footsteps of Mahatma Gandhi for the developed India. Gandhi will be remembered for all his good works, and some say that Gandhiji, originality as a thinker and political leader, appears mostly dramatically in his theory and practice of non-violence. No one before, no one before, dear learners, in history had conceived of non-violence and applied it to politics like Gandhi. And it's very interesting that I'm concluding that although Gandhi was inspired by the Hindu concept of ahimsa, which means literally non-injury, as well as by the Christianity and the writings of Tolstoy and Thoreau, none of these influence provided a blueprint for him to follow when he developed his conception of satyagraha. Conceptual connections between non-violence and truth, Swaraj, and Satyagraha as well as defense of non-violent resistance as a courageous method capable of succeeding where violence must fail appeared first in Hind Swaraj. These ideas were suffering as they were applied to the freedom struggle of India. The power of Gandhi, dear learners, was immense. April 13 is remembered for the Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar massacre. The 28-year national movement that followed the Amritsar massacre, as I said, 13th April, mobilized the country in three successive civil disobedience campaigns. Occurred years apart, the first non-violent non-cooperation campaign, 1919-22, 1919, 1922, the mass civil disobedience movement, the salt satyagraha, 1930 to 1931, and the wartime resistance or the Quit India movement. It was historic. The government 1942 to 44, each of these, dear learners, 1919, 1922, 1930, 31, and 1942 to 44, each of these targeted specific issues such as the salt tax in 1930, but all had the general aim of attaining Swaraj. You see, a number of political scientists, historians have nomenclated the period from 1919 to 1947, the freedom of India, as the period of the Gandhian era. Just because the persistence, work, and dedication during the struggle period, freedom struggle of Mahatma Gandhi for treating and fighting against the Britishers to make India free. And it will be recorded in golden letters in the history of the mankind. Thus, in my own humble way, I must tell you, my dear learners, that Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the nation, lent much credence to the methods and the techniques of non-violent protest in the history of the mankind, which will be a unique milestone in the history of India. Now, dear learners, I have dealt and elaborated on the civil society and the state, civil society in the globalization market, civil society and the political regimes, civil society, the resistance and the protest, and the keynote was truth and non-violence of Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the nation. And it will be remembered as a historic milestone in the not only in the history of India, but in the history of the world as a unique milestone in history. And what Gandhi said before the people, he was practicing them. Not only he was telling, not implementing, but he was doing both the work, preaching as well as in action. This is something extraordinary and unique, which we rarely find with the present day leadership. Of course, there are good leaders, but to my mind, Gandhiji was unparalleled and was unique in the system and remembered till today. I may also say something on the anti-nuclear protest movement very briefly. Dear learners, after the US government's atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, recognition the dangers that nuclear war posed to human survival sparked the development of an anti-nuclear movement in the United States and abroad. The Manhattan Project scientists, some of whom had opposed the use of nuclear weapons during the World War II, organized the Federation of Atomic Scientists, which later became the Federation of American Scientists, and the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, with Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Eugene Rabinowitz playing leading roles in a crusade for nuclear disarmament. World government movement also warned of the menace of the nuclear war, as did Pacific groups like the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the War Registers League, and the Women International League for Peace and Freedom. A communist-led anti-nuclear campaign focused on the Stockholm Peace petition surfaced as well. With the deepening of the Cold War, however, the American attitude grew more hawkish and the protest movement dwindled. In 1954, though another wave of protest began simultaneously, stimulated by the terrible destructiveness of the newly developed hydrogen bomb and by the atmospheric testing of this weapon, which coated the planet with radioactive fallout. Joining with British philosopher Bertrand Russell, Einstein issued a dramatic appeal to a world leader who halt the nuclear arms race. Subsequently, meeting in Pugwas, Nova Scotia, scientists launched the periodic Pugas Conference of scientists from East and West, with various scientists from East and West discuss the nuclear issues, while chemist Linus Pauling began a scientist petition calling for an end to nuclear testing. In 1957, Norman Cousins, editor of the Saturday Review, and other nuclear critics organized the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, SANE, a group that placed anti-nuclear ads in newspapers, held public meetings and demonstrations, initiated petitions, drives, and soon had 25,000 members. Established in 1959, the Student Peace Union mobilized college students against the nuclear menace and introduced Britain's nuclear disarmament symbol in America. 2 years later, Women's Strike for Peace, founded by Dagmar Wilson and other concerned mothers, brought thousands of women into the streets demonstrating for an end to nuclear testing and nuclear arm race. These democratic protests played an important role in convincing previously reluctant governments to negotiate the limited nuclear test ban treaty 1963. And the steps, as I enunciated, the words of Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, for the use of these atomic weapons and peace. Because lasting peace is the only remedy for a better society, for a civil society. Only lasting peace is the only remedy. I congratulate my students, the dear learners, for listening, and I'm sure it will be utilized and not only the Gandhian philosophy and thought for passing the examination, but to be better living human beings. And I wish good success, and I'm sure you have listened, and I'm happy with the note that woods are lovely, dark and deep, and I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Thank you. Thank you very much.